Hi, my name is Colin Lightbody, and I'm the president and founder of HR and Labor Guru, Inc. On behalf of the company, I'd like to welcome you to our on-demand webinar series. Before we get into the presentation materials, I'd like to take a few minutes to let you know a bit about our company and also give you some insight into my professional background. First, let's talk about the company. HR and Labor Guru's goals are to provide practical, value-added, human resource and labor solutions to our clients through on-demand webinars, plus training and consulting engagements. Our company specializes in a number of areas, including the following. First is bargaining preparation and strategy formulation for labor negotiations, development of negotiations costing models and bargaining tools, identification of opportunities to reduce and/or mitigate rising labor costs, healthcare cost reduction strategies, addressing high unplanned absenteeism, including Fmla in the United States, and finally, HR analytics in terms of building effective analytics teams and identifying and executing high-value projects. Next, let's talk about my professional background. I established HR and Labor Guru in 2019 after retiring from Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, or FCA, with 20 years of service. My last position held at Fiat Chrysler was Director of Labor Economics, People Analytics and Insights, and Hourly Attendance at Chrysler World Headquarters in Auburn Hills, Michigan. In terms of labor negotiations, I have over 20 years of union negotiations experience, and I've been actively involved in numerous multi-billion-dollar deals. While at Fiat Chrysler, I was actively involved in virtually every set of national negotiations in the United States with the United Auto Workers Union since 2003, every set in Canada with Unifor, formerly known as the Canadian Auto Workers Union, since 1999, and every set in Mexico with the CTM Union since 2004. My roles and responsibilities ranged from being a bargaining subcommittee chairperson to benefits accounting, labor economics, and labor strategy expert, to negotiating with presidents of the national labor unions. In 2007, I participated in the negotiation of the transfer of Chrysler's multi-billion-dollar retiree healthcare obligation to a United Auto Workers Union-sponsored healthcare trust. In addition, over the years, I was actively involved in facilitating several special agreements, including corporate restructuring deals pertaining to shift eliminations, plant divestitures, and plant closures. In my opinion, though, my biggest claim to fame is the fact that for many years, I provided strategic bargaining guidance and worked directly with the late FCA Chief Executive Officer, Sergio Marchionne, arguably one of the best negotiators of all time. Also, I was a member of the Mercer Labor Employee Relations Network in the United States for over 10 years. Therefore, I had the distinct pleasure of networking, benchmarking, and sharing best practices with some of the world's top labor executives from multiple industries on topics ranging from absenteeism challenges to labor negotiation strategies. In terms of HR analytics, as head of the People Analytics and Insights team at Fiat Chrysler, I directed numerous special studies, including the following: internal labor market maps and employee turnover studies for the salaried workforce, and deep dive studies on topics such as absenteeism and hourly hiring process for the hourly workforce. In addition, I was an active member of Mercer's HR Analytics Network, known as the Internal Labor Market Network, for over 3 years in the United States. As a member of this group, I had the opportunity of networking with some of the world's top HR analytics professionals and consultants. We regularly shared stories about growing pains, the challenges, the success stories, and the lessons learned from our unique HR analytics journeys. From an educational perspective, I'm a professional accountant, both a CPA and CA, and I was employed at Deloitte & Touche for 10 years prior to joining Fiat Chrysler. I also hold a Bachelor of Commerce degree with a concentration in accounting and finance from the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, and also hold a Master of Business Administration degree with a concentration in human resources and labor relations from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Breaking the HR analytics paradigm is referring to the fact that, to date, it appears that most HR analytics teams are focusing on salary workforce analytics. However, in my opinion, there is some significant low-hanging fruit in terms of potential cost savings that may be identified through hourly workforce analytics. Analysis of hourly workforce data can create an excellent opportunity for HR analytics teams to develop quick wins by identifying potential operational improvements and also significant cost savings. In this webinar, we will focus on opportunities associated with three distinct topics: absenteeism, the hourly hiring process, and hourly payroll. The learning objectives for this module are as follows. First, learn about the utilization of data stratification techniques to identify key focus areas. Also, recognize the high costs associated with unplanned absenteeism. Drill down on hourly employee absenteeism data to identify key focus areas, and then to learn how to develop comprehensive solutions to address chronic employee absenteeism, as well as potential misuse of Family Medical Leave Act entitlements in the United States. In the second section, we'll look at how you can recognize the high costs associated with a bad hire, and we'll conduct a deep dive analysis of a typical hourly hiring process, and then we'll learn how to identify hiring process improvements with the goal of improving both the quality of hire, minimizing the time to fill job openings, and overall reducing hiring costs. Then finally, we'll look at analyzing hourly payroll data in order to identify potential cost reduction opportunities related to items such as overtime pay, as well as grievance pay and union official pay in unionized settings. The bottom line here is if you can add value, as you can grow your analytics team. Who will benefit from this webinar? Basically, any directors or vice presidents directly involved or even indirectly involved in these topics: absenteeism, the hourly hiring process, or payroll. So it can be anyone going from finance to HR to labor relations. Analytics professionals will gain something from this. Human resources professionals like the CHRO, or in particular the talent acquisition team. Also even labor relations professionals, people who are attendance leads in your plants or perhaps labor supervisors. And then finally from the finance area, controllers and anyone involved in hourly payroll would benefit from this webinar. So first we'll do another quick introduction into the Breaking the HR Analytics Paradigm webinar. As mentioned earlier, over the past few years, almost every HR analytics professional I've spoken to has indicated that they're focusing primarily on analytics associated with the salary or white-collar workforce. And in my opinion, there is some significant low-hanging fruit associated with HR analytics related to the hourly or blue-collar workforce. There are opportunities for both operational improvements and significant cost savings. And your operations colleagues will absolutely love the fact that you're looking into these areas for them. Another thing I want to reiterate throughout this webinar is I highly encourage HR analytics teams to get more involved in developing and implementing solutions. We'll see that as we go through here. And for purposes of this webinar, we've identified three illustrative examples of potential analytics opportunities relative to the hourly workforce. The first one is absenteeism. The second one is the hourly hiring process. And the third one is looking at hourly payroll data. So now we'll turn to the first section: hourly employee absenteeism. As an introduction, high absenteeism can have a significant impact on a company's bottom line financial results. There are numerous costs, both direct costs and indirect costs, associated with high absenteeism. For example, the cost of replacement workers. These costs may include the direct cost of the absence itself, for example, someone receiving sickness and accident benefits, overtime costs for co-workers, for example, employees who are augmenting shifts or being called in, the cost of full-time or temporary replacement employees. Those are all direct and indirect costs associated with high absenteeism. The second one is the impact on quality. In an ideal state, organizations should have a trained operator on the job at all times in order to protect quality, and these costs are often very difficult to quantify. Thirdly, there's also an impact on employee morale. Poor quality or lost productivity may affect coworkers financially. For example, they may receive lower profit-sharing bonuses. In addition, coworkers may become tired of covering for chronic absenteeism. And also, chronic abusers may be posting pictures of themselves on social media, for example, at sporting events. That decreases the morale of the other employees. Finally, there's an impact on productivity. And lost units and or revenue may be very difficult to make up, and it may cost more to generate this replacement revenue, for example, overtime costs to generate it. There may be greater challenges for businesses that have fully integrated assembly lines like the automotive manufacturing industry, especially at the start of a shift where essentially every workstation needs to be manned in order to produce one single unit. In contrast, at a grocery store, if one of the cashiers doesn't show up, the companies can still make money because the customers can just go to some of the other cashiers, so they're still able to get their revenue in another way. Unlike the automotive industry, in an assembly line, they can't even start the line until everyone is there. In talking to colleagues at conferences over the years, high absenteeism is a major concern across many, many industries, including the manufacturing industry, hospitality industry, the healthcare sector with hospitals, and also the services industry. And based upon my conversations, concerns are primarily centered around unplanned absenteeism, things like just casual absences and intermittent FMLA, because companies can typically plan for things like holidays and vacations and things of that nature. It's the unplanned absenteeism that causes the most concern for employers. While it may not directly assist an organization in reducing absenteeism, it may be helpful to understand why employees are taking time off work. Based upon discussions with colleagues from various industries over the past few years, there are a number of perceived reasons for excessive unplanned absenteeism, including the following. Excessive scheduled overtime. Employees just want a break or want time to attend a function. There could be also childcare issues, elder care commitments. Some employees are just working for benefit coverage. They don't necessarily need the money as much as they need the benefits for either themselves or one of their dependents. Some folks are living with their parents and just don't need the money. They also need time to attend a function, as mentioned earlier. And finally, there's the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA in the United States, that we're going to get into more detail in the next slide. Based upon discussions with employers from various industries, utilization of intermittent Family Medical Leave Act leaves is on the rise, and accordingly it is becoming a major concern for employers in the United States. Employers' concerns include the following. Many employers believe that employees are seeing the Family Medical Leave Act as a low-risk opportunity to secure more time off, and in some cases, employees are utilizing FMLA to circumvent the strict attendance policies that these employers have put in place. With social media now, FMLA misuse is in your face. There are memes all over the internet, as we'll see some examples on the next slide. And as mentioned earlier, there's an impact on employee morale when they see abusers posting pictures of themselves having a great time on Facebook. Also, many employers are finding FMLA extremely difficult to administer and control, and also costly to challenge suspected misuse. For example, the legal costs, the cost of investigators, the cost of second and third medical opinions, things of that nature. And some employers and supervisors are hesitant to challenge suspected misuse in fear of being sued by employees. This is unfortunate, especially when it appears that employers fully support legitimate FMLA leaves. This next slide illustrates some of the FMLA memes that are out there on the internet. For example, the Friday-Monday Leave Act instead of the Family Medical Leave Act. These memes effectively poke fun at the known FMLA abuse that's going on out there. In order to address high unplanned absenteeism, companies should focus on the following key strategies. First, conduct deep dive analytics on absenteeism data. First thing is to identify areas of focus, and the best way to do this is to utilize stratification tools, as we'll see later. Also, you want to identify areas of potential abuse, for example, FMLA misuse in the United States, and we'll see that one of the best opportunities here is to utilize pattern recognition. Also, you want to identify root causes for the excessive absenteeism so you can fully understand why these things are occurring. Then you want to develop potential solutions to address unplanned absenteeism. When looking at potential solutions, we want to focus on chronic absenteeism, things such as casual absences or FMLA misuse that we spoke about earlier, and also look at the root causes of absenteeism. And where practical, it may make sense to do some unusual things, like, for example, if it's because of childcare, consider maybe on-site childcare or subsidies for childcare if that's one of the problems. Also, we're going to take a look at considering cost-effective strategies to convert unplanned absenteeism to planned absenteeism. Now let's turn our attention to HR analytics. This is an excellent opportunity for the HR analytics team to conduct a deep dive analysis on absenteeism data. And I think what you'll often find is that the 80-20 rule applies. That is, 20% of your employees are driving 80% of your absenteeism problems. The trick, of course, here is to identify the 20% and then to implement appropriate countermeasures to change behaviors. So one of the best things to do, as mentioned earlier, is utilize stratification techniques to help focus your attention. So the first thing you want to do is start at the 50,000 foot level, then work your way down or drill down deeper. And it's best to segregate data by major category. For example, break it down by vacation, FMLA, casual absences, sickness and accident, and other types of absences. And where possible, utilize line graphs or pie charts to illustrate high-level results. That'll really help you focus on what really matters the most. And it's always helpful to illustrate absenteeism data in two different ways. One, show it as the number or percentage of lost time hours, and also number two, look at number or percentage of lost time incidents. You'll see later why it's important to look at both ways. I think the best way to illustrate this is through an example on the next slide. So the chart on the left-hand side is really absenteeism in terms of hours. In contrast, the chart on the right depicts absenteeism in terms of number of incidents or occurrences. I'd like to focus your attention on two elements: the red pie slice, which is intermittent FMLA, and the yellow pie slice, which is casual absenteeism. Both, in this case, let's assume, are unplanned absences. So if you look at the left-hand chart, 1/3 of absenteeism hours are comprised of intermittent FMLA and casual absences, yet they account for almost 2/3 of absenteeism incidents on the right-hand chart. So you can see the left-hand chart, you have 25% of your hours are FMLA, 8% of your hours are casual absences, so 33% on the left-hand chart in terms of hours, but on the right-hand chart, you've got 55% FMLA and 10% casual absences, so almost 2/3 of the incidences or occurrences. This suggests that many of these incidents are short-term in nature, for example, tardies or lates and home earlies, and they're much more difficult to manage from an operational perspective. Just as an example, it's more difficult to replace 8 employees who are absent 1 hour at a time than replacing 1 employee who is absent for 8 hours. So this shows you what to focus on. And that's why it's so important to illustrate absenteeism or lost time in two different ways, in terms of hours and incidents. So now let's drill down further into the data, and we're going to focus on intermittent FMLA utilization. So we're going to have a number of charts in the next few slides that look at intermittent FMLA utilization in different ways. So this first chart looks at intermittent FMLA utilization incidents by employee quartile. So you want to drill down further on these key focus areas. And you want to ask yourself, is intermittent FMLA, is the 80-20 rule that we referred to earlier in effect? And in this case, it illustrates that it in fact is. It's a key observation in this slide, right? 25% of your employees, or your first quartile, are accounting for 75% of all of your intermittent FMLA incidents. So that allows you to focus. And then you continue to drill down further. Ask probing questions. Is the utilization of FMLA consistent with the frequency and duration as outlined in their FMLA certification from their doctors? Are there any patterns? And again, when you're looking at this data, you always have to respect privacy laws. You don't want to get into things like why do they have FMLA utilization? It's just what is the frequency and duration, things of that nature. The next chart is just another way to look at it. Let's look at intermittent FMLA utilization incidents by the day of week. And you can see in this case, you drill down further and look for patterns again. And again, the key observation, nearly 2/3 of intermittent FMLA utilization occurs on Mondays and Fridays. So you can see Mondays account for 30% of your utilization, and Fridays about 35%. So 65% of your intermittent FMLA utilization was occurring on Fridays and Mondays. So drill down further. Who is utilizing it the most? Is there a certain number of employees? Is the usage, again, is it consistent with frequency and duration as outlined in the employee's FMLA certification? Under what circumstances would an employee only have symptoms on Fridays? This next slide looks at intermittent FMLA utilization incidents by employee usage level. So let's first focus on the middle column, 25 to 49. What that is saying is that the majority of employees are utilizing FMLA 25 to 49 times in 1 year. So if you drill down further, stratify it by level of employee usage, you can see here that 75% of incidents are driven by employees who utilize intermittent FMLA more than 2 times per month. So that would be the middle column, 25 to 49, 50% of the employees there, plus 20% of your employees that are using it 50 to 99 times in a year, plus the 5% of the employees who are utilizing it greater than 100 times in a year. So again, focus on this 75% first. Again, is the usage consistent with the frequency and duration outlined in the FMLA certification? So this kind of ties back to the fact that we saw earlier, 25% of employees are driving 75% of utilization. Kind of the 80-20 rule is in effect. And finally, the last illustrative example we're going to look at is intermittent FMLA utilization incidence by duration of leave. So by duration of leave, we're going to look at tardies or lates that are less than 1 hour in duration, tardies or lates that are greater than 1 hour in duration, then full day absences, and then home early. So if employees leave work early, less than an hour before the end of the shift, or home early greater than 1 hour before the end of the shift. Those are the different buckets we're going to look at. So the key observation here is that tardies or lates less than 1 hour represent the most common intermittent FMLA leave. 35%, so over a third of your incidents are tardies less than 1 hour. So in this case, we really need a comprehensive approach to address all durations. Is the usage consistent with the frequency and duration outlined in the FMLA certification? And if FMLA certification is for a 4-hour medical treatment once per month, why is the employee late for work 2 times per week? All valid questions to ask and to challenge. So we've seen here several examples of how to drill down on absenteeism data. And there are many other ways to cut the data. You can be as creative as you want. These are just some quick examples. And intermittent FMLA is just one example that we looked at here. The same principles can be applied to other types of absenteeism as well. Casual absences, sickness and accident, and so on. The key is to focus your attention on what matters and start with the low-hanging fruit first. So once focus areas are identified, then you have to dig deeper, then look for potential solutions to address high absenteeism. Next, we'll turn our attention to potential solutions to address high absenteeism. And we'll find that potential solutions may come from different sources. Plant supervisors, for example, are in an excellent position to identify absenteeism issues or even to identify employees that they consider to be abusing the system. Well-informed plant supervisors can give HR or labor relations a heads up when some of their employees routinely come in and ask to leave early from a shift, and then once denied, come back 10 or 20 minutes later with a request for FMLA leave. Things like that. If your company has multiple facilities or locations, it's also a good idea to share best practices. Analytics teams should compare absenteeism data from one facility to the other and then drill down to try to understand why the top facilities are where they are. What are they doing differently than the other ones? You may find that the top performing plant or facility in terms of absenteeism data may be doing something differently. Perhaps the plant manager is focusing on absenteeism in his weekly staff meeting, and maybe the plant manager is asking his team to focus on the top 10 employees in terms of unplanned absenteeism over the past week or month. Other opportunities for potential solutions may come from benchmarking. Chances are others in your industry are having similar problems with high absenteeism, and they may be willing to talk to you about it, and you can learn from each other. Third-party administrators are also an excellent source of information. For example, if your company utilizes third-party administrators or experts for certain HR functions such as FMLA administration or disability management, don't be afraid to ask these third parties open-ended questions like, what are your other clients doing that our organization is not doing, etc. And based upon my experience, these third parties are both willing and able to provide excellent insights. And finally, take a good look at your collective agreement. You may already have some contractual provisions in your agreement that no one has really looked at or implemented over the years. It may be another good source of information for you that can potentially provide some solutions to absenteeism. Next, we'll turn our attention to opportunities to reduce and or mitigate the costs associated with absenteeism. The first thing a company can do is to clearly address absenteeism in its new hire orientation sessions. Companies should emphasize the importance of showing up to work every day, and also indicate that they take absenteeism very seriously. In addition, employers should advise new hires that they will investigate any suspected fraudulent activity, including any misuse of FMLA entitlements, and that this could lead to the termination of the employee if the employer's suspicions are proven correct. Next, the employer should implement a strong attendance policy that addresses both absences and tardies or lates. Typically, the policy will have multiple steps in a progressive discipline format, starting with verbal warnings, then written warnings, disciplinary layoffs, and ultimately perhaps leading to dismissal of the employee. Another key opportunity is to ensure that supervisors and/or labor relations individuals serve attendance discipline outlined in the attendance policy in a timely manner in order to reduce absenteeism. The next opportunity is for employers to establish a turnaround policy where, for example, the company has the right to send the employee home without pay in the event that he or she shows up more than an hour late. This approach may discourage tardiness, as employees may be able to afford losing 1 hour of pay, but can they afford to lose pay for an entire day or an entire shift? Another opportunity is to require that the employee either works or is compensated for 40 hours before overtime premium is applicable. This approach may discourage the employee who does not come into work on a Friday but wants to come into work at time and a half pay on Saturday to make up for it. Utilization of temporary employees provides an excellent opportunity to reduce the effects of absenteeism and also to mitigate the costs associated with absenteeism. Unions are often supportive of utilizing temporary employees, provided they're dues-paying union members. From a replacement cost perspective, the all-in labor cost of a temporary employee is often 1/2 to 2/3 of the cost of a traditional employee, creating significant labor cost savings opportunities. And the cost of a temporary employee is typically lower for the following reasons. Normally have a lower base wage rate, often at the starting wage rate of a traditional employee, if not lower. And if the temporary employee is working part-time on weekends, times of high unplanned absenteeism, overtime premiums may be saved versus a traditional employee. Also, temporary employees normally receive minimal, if any, fringe benefits. Any healthcare benefits offered are usually quite basic and will likely not include coverage for things like prescription drugs, dental, or vision. And in situations where the company hires the sons or daughters of employees as temps, they are often already covered on the employee's benefits, so there are minimal or no incremental costs. Effectively, you're giving the sleeves out of your vest in those situations. And finally, temporary employees typically do not have any income protection in the event of layoff or job loss, so there are some cost mitigation strategies associated with using temps. Some employers have just realized that it's not worth fighting the battle with unplanned absenteeism on certain times, like Fridays and Saturdays and so on, so they're just trying to convert unplanned absenteeism into planned absenteeism. One way to accomplish this is to create a pool of trained temporary employees. These temporary employees would replace full-time employees on high-volume absenteeism times such as Friday nights and Saturday nights. So for example, if you had a pool of 100 trained temporary employees, perhaps 2 weeks in advance, you could offer the weekend to your full-time employees and allow up to 100 people to sign up to go off without any repercussions. While this situation may not be ideal, the advantage is that you're converting unplanned absenteeism into planned absenteeism, and you're reducing the employees with a trained individual who is likely being paid less than what the full-time employee would otherwise be receiving. Another recommendation is to be strict with medical substantiation. Take the time to challenge the validity of doctor's notes. Look for inconsistencies. For example, if an employee tries to come back to work on a Friday and that employee has been off since Monday, look at the date of the doctor's note. If the doctor's note was dated on, say, Wednesday or Thursday, why didn't that employee treat with a physician on Monday or Tuesday? Challenge that. How is the doctor in a position to indicate that the employee was actually sick on the Monday and Tuesday as well? Now we're going to turn our attention to opportunities that are specific to the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, in the United States. The first recommendation is just to stick to minimum legislative requirements. What I'm referring to there is just the time frames that are allowed under the FMLA legislation for things like recertification, things of that nature. The second point is having FMLA run concurrent with paid time off and sickness and accident benefits. FMLA consultants suggest that the single best deterrent to FMLA misuse is to insist that FMLA leaves are run concurrent with paid time off entitlements as allowed under the Family Medical Leave Act. In other words, if an employee utilizes a day of FMLA leave, they are deemed to have utilized a day of vacation. In theory, an employee who is contemplating the misuse of FMLA for a day may think twice before doing so if they also use up a day of vacation entitlement. Another recommendation is that all appropriate parties, whether they're in HR, labor relations, or even supervisors, should have access to frequency and duration data as well. We always have to remember to respect employee privacy. As an example, if a supervisor has access to the frequency and duration data of an employee, and that frequency and duration data suggests that the employee can be off roughly 2 to 3 times per month for 4 hours at a time, and they notice that on a regular basis, say 2 or 3 times per week, the employee is late for 15 or 20 minutes in claiming FMLA, they're in a position to be able to challenge that information. And as mentioned before, employers should look at pattern recognition, not just for irrespective of frequency and duration, also look at the timing that things are occurring. For example, is someone only going home early on Friday afternoons? That's the type of information you're looking for in terms of patterns. It's also a good idea to pay attention to social media. You'll be absolutely amazed what some people post on their day off on things like Facebook. Another potential opportunity is where employers set up hotlines for employees to call in anonymously and report fraud or suspected misuse or abuse. Employees may be sick and tired of having to cover off their fellow employees' jobs, or may just be fed up with hearing them brag about how they used FMLA as an excuse to get out of work in order to go and see a baseball game. In more severe cases, companies should request second and perhaps even third medical opinions in the event that FMLA certifications do not appear valid. And finally, terminations may be warranted in cases that are extremely blatant and fraudulent. One interesting point to note here is that the news of some of these terminations tend to leak out into the facility or location that you're at, and it is amazing the deterrent effect that this may have on your overall population. Now, on the next slide, we're going to take a look at some carrot and stick approaches that can be utilized to reduce and or mitigate the costs associated with absenteeism. The first concept we're going to look at is a carrot, which is in the form of an attendance award. These awards can be developed to encourage attendance, and these awards can also form part of an employee's overall compensation package, which is really interesting during union bargaining. In this illustrative example, employees are eligible for a $100 attendance award every 4 weeks. This equates to roughly 62 cents per hour worked, assuming a 40-hour week. So in concept, the award is paid if the employee either works every scheduled shift or if the employee has utilized paid time off for the scheduled day. So for example, if they're able to cover a day off because they had vacation or they had paid bereavement leave or things of that nature, then they're covered off for that day, so that doesn't count as a negative towards them. The nice thing about this structure of this award is that there's a quick fall off for the award eligibility. As you can see in the chart, perfect attendance gives you $100 in that 4-week time period. But then once you have one absence, there's automatically a 50% reduction. So you're only going to get $50 for that 4-week period. And then there's a quick fall off, whereas if you have 2 absences or more, you receive 100% reduction or $0 for that period. The other nice thing about it is there's a fast recovery time, 4 weeks, in the event that an employee has absences. We all know that some people fall off the wagon sometimes, but if they do fall off the wagon and have a couple of absences that they just can't help, then the next 4-week period they can get back on the saddle again and get the award. The next concept we'll look at is the stick approach. So a couple of examples here where you can link attendance to benefit entitlements or eligibility for benefits. The first example can be vacation eligibility. So in the automotive sector, Detroit 3, you have to work at least 26 weeks in a year to receive full vacation entitlement. You can tighten it up and maybe you have to work at least 45 weeks in the prior year to receive full vacation entitlement. So that's more of a stick approach. And the second example looks at defined contribution pension plan, where you can base your formula on compensated hours which is good because if you don't work, then you don't get any contribution into your pension plan. So another example of a kind of a stick approach. So these carrot and stick approaches can work well. So for hourly employee absenteeism, in summary, high absenteeism can have a significant impact on a company's bottom line financial results, as we've seen here. And there's also an excellent opportunity for HR analytics teams to get involved and add value. Our concerns with absenteeism are primarily centered around unplanned absenteeism, like casual absences, intermittent FMLA, etc. And we've also seen that stratification techniques allow the team to quickly focus on the low-hanging fruit. And as well, there's no silver bullet to address high absenteeism. As you can see, it requires a comprehensive approach and significant effort from various teams in order to address this difficult topic. And also, I strongly encourage HR analytics teams to remain involved in developing and implementing solutions, and your operational people will appreciate that. The second hourly employee data analytics opportunity is with respect to the hourly hiring process. As noted, across many industries, it is not uncommon to hear that operations groups are critical of their human resources teams for a couple of things. One is for recruiting poor quality employees, and two, the time it takes to fill job openings. Often the complaints center around the following key issues: high employee turnover, high absenteeism in the employees, lack of attention to detail or poor quality from the employees, low employee engagement for things such as lack of kaizans or employee suggestions being offered by those that are hired, safety concerns, and again, as mentioned earlier, time to fill these job openings. Accordingly, the HR analytics team's focus should be to assist the talent acquisition team on improving two things. One, the quality of hire, and secondly, improve the efficiency of the process itself to help reduce the time to fill open positions. So first we'll take a look at quality of hire. What are the characteristics of a successful hire? We have to look at all the relevant data. Some of it may include attendance, attention to detail, or quality. Employee engagement. Are the employees that are being hired, are they providing kaizans or employee suggestions to make improvements to the process? Do they have a good safety record? What do the performance appraisals look like? So when we're looking at things, we want to see if there are signals in a hiring process that predict top employees. Is there things like test scores or interviews? What are the results that are showing the best candidates? And then how can we modify the hiring process to attract and tease out the best job candidates? The second aspect we want to look at is the time to fill. So we want to look at how can we potentially redesign the hiring process to reduce the time to fill open positions. Again, the hourly hiring process provides an excellent environment for conducting deep dive analytics and add value. It's an excellent cross-functional project, and there's an opportunity to work with numerous teams, including talent acquisition, including any third-party administrators, so to get an understanding of the hiring process. You also get to work with operations to ensure that their customer needs are met. What are the key elements that they're looking for in an ideal candidate? And also work with legal to ensure that the appropriate compliance with the law, make sure that tests are job-related, there's appropriate validation being performed, and that you consider ban-the-box issues if you're operating in certain states. So as you're going through the module, I'd like you to consider utilizing this three-step process in the future. Step 1 is to obtain a detailed understanding of the hourly hiring process. Step 2, collect and analyze the data. And then step 3 is to identify and recommend proposed modifications. So in turn, we'll take a look at all of these steps. Step 1 is to obtain a detailed understanding of the hourly hiring process. This is a really important step as it provides the necessary foundation to enable you to identify opportunities to improve efficiencies, reduce time to fill open positions, and to potentially reduce costs. It's really important that you map out the hiring process or hiring funnel in detail and look at the pipeline statistics and look at what's behind it. So the first thing is to basically describe the various steps of the process, starting with the application all the way through to the ultimate hire of the employee. Secondly, you want to look at what are your per candidate costs at each step along the way. And these costs can be pretty significant, especially if they're being performed by an outside vendor. It could range from, say, $20 per candidate for a drug test to in excess of $500 per candidate in the event that the third party is conducting a production simulation test. And then also look at what are the fallout rates at each step. How many people fall out after the initial screening? How many people fall out after testing? How many people fall out of the process because of a background check or because of a drug screen? So those are all very important steps to look at. And finally, remember, you're looking at this process with a fresh set of eyes. So ask yourself, is the process flow logical? Does it make sense? Are there things that can be bypassed, things that should be added, things that can be done more efficiently? This next slide has an illustrative chart of a typical hourly hiring process. And as you can see, it starts off with the application, then the initial screening, then testing, then conditional job offer, then background check, drug testing, and then ultimately hire if everything goes properly. So the application, the employees are just either doing it online or in person. Initial screening are just basically, screening out people for, do they meet the age requirement for the job, the basic requirements of being able to work certain days of the week or overtime. The testing can take a number of forms. It can be anything from online testing to production simulations that are done by a third party. It could be interviews, whether in person or on Skype, then conditional job offers, and then background checks. And sometimes these things like background checks and drug testing take quite a bit of time to complete. So those are areas where you can perhaps tighten up your time to fill as an opportunity, and then the ultimate hire. So that's just kind of a typical layout of what a process would look like. One of the things I truly believe in is that HR analytics teams should go through the process personally. They should complete the application, they should watch the videos, and take the tests, get a really good understanding of what's really going on in order to make process improvement recommendations. There are a few considerations. Consider benchmarking. If there are places around you that you can access to do some benchmarking on their hourly hiring process, go for it, because you're going to learn something from them. Also, third-party administrators are an excellent source of information. Ask them to share best practices. And in general, just look for efficiencies. Ask the questions. Are candidates being screened out efficiently and cost-effectively at the appropriate step? Questions like that are very valuable. Step 2 is collect and analyze the data. So the first order of business in this step is to decide upon what data to collect and analyze. Ideally, data should be both relevant and easily available. You want to talk to operating management, including supervisors, in order to fully understand what the ideal employee looks like. What are the key attributes that we should be testing for? Common attributes in a manufacturing operation may include the following: attendance, quality, attention to detail, multitasking, safety, employee engagement, as an example, employee suggestions and kaizens, employee turnover, and also supervisor ratings and performance appraisals. Is the data that we want to examine readily available? For example, data related to attributes. Do we have the data on attendance? Do we have the data on employee suggestions or on safety? And if it's historical hiring data, do we have the test scores and the interview scores at our fingertips? And from a practical perspective, it may make sense to focus on new hires over the past X number of years just to keep things in perspective. And if data related to attributes is not available, you may want to consider creating a comprehensive supervisor assessment for relevant employees, or at least a representative sample is practical. And if historical hiring data is not available, the study will need to focus on attribute scores of ideal employees versus attribute scores of average or poor employees. Then we'll have to examine the attributes and summarize the data. For example, segregate great hires from average and poor hires, including those resignations and terminations. The next order of business is to analyze the data. If historical hiring data is available, were there signals that an employee would be a great hire or a poor hire? What are the key differentiators between a great hire and an average or poor hire? Try to identify those. Where historical data is not available, what are the key differentiators between a great hire and an average or poor hire based on supervisor assessments and so on? Are there certain attributes that stand out? So think back to your knowledge of the hiring process. Is the process accurately testing and screening for the right attributes? Are we teasing out the ideal candidates? If not, consider modifying a number of things. The tests themselves, the cut scores on the tests, or the weighting of the attributes in determining the final outcome. Step 3 is to identify and recommend proposed modifications. Proposed recommendations can be grouped into two basic categories. The first one is analytics-based proposals, and the primary focus of this is to improve the quality of hire. For example, to do this, you'd make modifications to things like cut scores, attribute testing, the attribute weightings, etc. The second one is process-based proposals, where the primary focus in this case is to reduce costs and improve efficiencies, including improving the time to fill job openings. For example, here you would want to restructure the hiring process, the nature of tests, is it online versus in person, physical testing, the order of doing such things. And also keep in mind that any proposed modifications to the hourly hiring process should be vetted through consultations with your legal advisors to ensure compliance with applicable laws, such as ban the box and things of that nature. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to look at some examples of each type of proposal. First, we'll look at the analytics-based proposals example, and then we'll look at some process-based proposal changes. So this next slide shows an illustrated example of analytics-based proposals. And in the chart, you can see along the top, you've got 5 different attributes: attribute 1, attribute 2, attribute 3, attribute 4, attribute 5. So, attribute 1 could be attendance, attribute 2 could be attention to detail, etc., etc. So the first line that you have there is weighting. So what is the total weighting of each of these attributes for purposes of the overall score? So attribute 1 is 10%, attribute 2, 25%. So in total, it adds up to 100% for all 5 attributes. And then you've got the cut score, which is out of 10 in this situation. And the cut score is, for attribute 1, it's 6. So a candidate would have to have a score of at least 6 in order to be considered for the position. And then below that, we've got the average ideal candidate score. So based on discussions with supervisors and operations and so on, the ideal candidates that you've identified, you've done your analytics, and here's the average score for an ideal candidate that they've identified. So attribute 1, it's an 8, 8 for 2, 8 for attribute 3. Attribute 4, the average score was 9, and attribute 5, the score was 8. And then below that, for illustration purposes, we've got the average score of all candidates, which in most cases is below that of the ideal candidates. So by putting a chart together like this and analyzing it like this, you can look for potential modifications. So the couple of potential modifications, you could consider moving cut scores for all attributes to at least a 7, because in most cases, the ideal candidates are scoring 8s and so on. And maybe for attribute 4, you can actually bump it up to an 8 because the average score is only 7 in that case. Another consideration is with your operations team approval, put more weight on attribute 1 by moving 5% weighting from attribute 2 to attribute 1. So that would have attribute 1 weighting would be 15% and attribute 2 would go down to 20%. So just developing these types of charts and this type of analysis, you can get an idea for some potential changes to make the process better and hire a better candidate. This next slide starts to talk about process-based proposals. And we saw in the illustration before of the sample hourly hiring process, there are many stages in the hourly hiring process as outlined earlier, starting with application and initial screening and so on. And the testing stage, the third stage, is arguably one of the most critical and often the most expensive aspect of the hiring process. So this is a really good area to focus on. And there are many alternatives and combinations of alternatives for testing, including the following: interviews, whether it's in person or by Skype, using behavior-based interview questions, etc. Also, in these days, there are a lot of online tests available. Things like competency and personality testing, where you're looking at multiple attributes and asking questions and putting some situation analysis out there. And also there are production simulation where you can test productivity, quality, safety, multitasking, all kinds of different attributes just through an online test. And then also you have live testing, whether it's in-house or perhaps a third-party production simulation. The thing with these tests, though, it sometimes takes several hours to conduct these tests, and they're often fairly expensive, especially if they're being monitored or facilitated by third-party providers. And every alternative in this case has its pros and cons. So moving on to the next slide, if the objective here is to reduce costs, the trick is to look for opportunities that remove redundancies. Does the process have multiple steps that test for the same attribute or attributes? And also, you can potentially move to a lower cost testing option that does not sacrifice quality. For example, online testing is usually relatively inexpensive and may be used in conjunction with more expensive types of testing, for example, in-person interviews or live production simulations. And the online testing can be utilized as a low-cost pre-screening step that will send better candidates to the more expensive second step. And I've put together an illustrative example to show you what I'm talking about here. So this next slide shows an illustrative example of a process-based proposal for improvement. Let's focus on the chart. Under both the current state and the proposed state, the number of candidates for testing is 100. So we're sending 100 at the front end of both cases. And at the bottom end, we're trying to push through 50 successful candidates. So let's look at the current state first. And as you can see, there's only one step in this process, step 2, which is an in-person assessment. So we've got 100 people, 100 candidates going into the system with a fail rate of 50%, and it's costing us $500 per candidate, so it's costing us $50,000. So we're getting 50% throughput, and it's costing us $50,000. And if you look to the right at the proposed state, we're going to introduce a less expensive online pre-assessment to try to screen out some of the candidates before sending them to the more expensive second step. So in step 1, we're putting in an online pre-assessment where all 100 candidates go through this pre-assessment online, and the cost per candidate is only $50. So you're failing out 25% in this case, and the cost to do that for all 100 candidates is $5,000. But by doing that, you're sending a much better candidate to the second, more expensive step. In this case, you're sending 75 candidates to the second step, and you're going to have a much better fail rate in terms of this case, it's 33% fail rate rather than a 50% fail rate because you've already kind of pre-screened some of those other employees out. So now you're only sending 75 people to that second step at $500 per candidate. So it's costing you $37,500 in total. So your total bill under the proposed state is $5,000 for the pre-screen and then $37,500 for the second step, the in-person assessment, for a total cost of $42,500. So as you can see, your number of successful candidates are the same, but your cost savings are $7,500 or a 15% reduction in your costs just by inserting that online pre-assessment, which is a cheaper way of screening out employees. So these are the types of proposals that you can do for the process that makes it more efficient and less expensive. This next slide, we're going to look at some other considerations. Some considerations are for time to fill efficiency. Consider accelerating certain steps in the hiring process, for example, background checks where it's possible, we have to watch the ban in the box, or drug testing where certain conditions exist. 1, the time to complete the task is lengthy, so in some cases it could take a week or 2 weeks to get background checks or drug testing back. The cost is low. Some of these things may only cost $20. And the third condition is where the fallout rate is low. In some cases, things like background checks and drug testing, you may be only screening out 5 to 10% of the population that's going through those tests. So where those conditions exist, it may make sense to accelerate those in the overall hiring process in order to improve your time to fill. Another consideration deals with interviews. You may want to consider involving your operations folks so that they have some skin in the game. As we mentioned earlier, operations folks are often critical of their human resource counterparts with respect to the time to fill, and more importantly, with the respect of the quality of the candidate. One way is to actually have operations get involved in the interviews so that they have some skin in the game and they have some say into that person who does get hired to work in their group. And for employers that are experiencing some significant post-hire resignations, there are also a couple other things to consider. One is a realistic job preview video. In many cases, new hires are quitting, a week or within 30 days of being hired because they really didn't know what to expect. For example, they may not have realized all the heavy lifting that was involved, or the hours and overtime commitments that were required, or even which shift they were on. Maybe they thought that they had their choice of shift, but as new employees who have low seniority, they're probably been put on the worst shift possible. So in many cases, if the company puts forward a realistic job preview video for employees to watch prior to even applying for the job, it may reduce some of those post-hire resignations. Another idea is work hard. This may be very useful if the jobs are very physical in nature. Perhaps the employer can shuffle some of the training that's going on with the new employee. Perhaps they can work 2 days the first day and have 6 hours of classroom training to do WMIS and things of that nature. And day 2, maybe it's 4 hours on the floor with 4 hours of in-classroom training. Day 3, maybe it's 6 hours on the floor with two hours of classroom training and so on, rather than shocking the employees right away with 8-hour shifts of physical labor. They just may not be used to it, and a work hardening approach may alleviate some of those post-hire resignations as well. So in summary, for the hourly hiring process, as you can see, there are many things to consider and take into consideration here. And HR analytics teams are in an excellent position to provide value-added insights relative to the hourly hiring process in terms of improving the quality of hire, reducing costs, and improving efficiency. So again, it's breaking that HR analytics paradigm. There's a lot of opportunity with hourly employee data, and this is another area of focus. The third and final section under breaking the HR analytics paradigm module is related to hourly payroll data. So as an introduction, most companies run payroll statistics, but many companies do not necessarily conduct deep dives on the data in order to understand the root cause behind anomalies. And there are numerous opportunities for HR analytics teams to conduct deep dives on payroll data, including the following examples: high overtime employees, union official pay, and grievance pay. And we'll see throughout this module that it makes total sense to utilize stratification techniques for this type of analysis. The first element we're going to look at is high overtime employees. One of the best ways to begin analyzing payroll data is to simply stratify the data by employee and rank it from highest to lowest. Typical payroll fields to investigate include total pay, overtime pay, total hours worked, and overtime hours worked. Once this data is captured and organized, management can begin to investigate employees who have excessive levels of overtime. In many cases, high levels of overtime for certain employees are found to be warranted due to key skill sets or high operating levels in certain departments. However, in other cases, high overtime for certain employees may not be warranted or just may not make sense. The key here is to drill down and look for patterns. Look at specific employees. Who are the high overtime employees? What are the job classifications that are incurring the most overtime? Are there certain departments? Are these departments incurring excessive overtime? Also, take a look at union officials. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but take a look at them as well. And the key here is to challenge unusual items. Are there any safety concerns? Are people working 16-hour days consistently? Is there any favoritism taking place? Perhaps supervisor and employees have a relationship there. Take a look at that. Is there an appropriate approval process in place for these things? And finally, do a cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes people are working such huge amounts of overtime that it may make sense to hire an additional employee, even if it carries with it an additional set of benefits, especially for employees that are working in excess of 1,000 or 1,500, sometimes 2,000 hours per year in overtime at time and a half and some double time. It probably makes more sense, and it's probably safer to hire an additional employee. So take a look. Does it make sense? And also, you should look at employees who are working low hours. In some cases, employees may just simply be working the bare minimum in order to receive full benefits such as healthcare coverage. The second area to focus your attention on is possibly union official pay. This is often a sensitive topic, and there are always a number of factors to consider. The key is to start off by stratifying pay by union official. Is overtime high for certain union officials, and if so, why? Start asking those types of questions. Is it because of shift augmentation? In some situations, you may see that union officials may stay over for 4 hours on the next shift simply because one of their constituents has been asked to stay over and augment for 4 hours of overtime. In these situations, it's probably the union official on that next shift that should be supervising the employee and not have the requirement for that first union official to augment the overtime as well. Another thing to look at, especially if the union officials are off-site on a regular basis, are they conducting union versus company business? That's another thing you might want to look at. And finally, look at the approval process for union official pay, whether it's base pay or overtime pay, and see who is the approver. And finally, the last element of hourly payroll data we want to talk about is grievance pay. So again, stratification techniques, stratify grievance payouts, and do it by employee, by supervisor, and also it's good to do it by type or reason code. For example, is overtime equalization the reason for grievance pay? And a lot of things to consider here. What's the approval process? Do supervisors in the plant have approval to verify a grievance pay, or is it plant managers, etc.? And also be aware of the fact that favoritism may be in play here with some certain supervisors, and are they just trying to keep the peace? And also keep in mind that there may be other remedies other than just paying for some of these grievances. For example, overtime equalization, if that's one of the reasons for the payout, sometimes contracts provide that the remedy for overtime equalization is that you go to the top of the list for being canvassed for future overtime. So there is no direct payout. So just know your contract, know what to look for, and you may find something under grievance pay as well. So in summary, for Breaking the HR Analytics Paradigm webinar, I'd like to talk about a few things. Numerous opportunities to apply HR analytics principles in an hourly workforce environment. Don't just focus on your salaried workforce, look at your hourly as well. And we've shown 3 examples of some good value-added projects here. One on absenteeism, one on the hourly hiring process, and one by just looking at hourly payroll data. And again, you require a detailed understanding of the issue or process, especially with hourly hiring and even absenteeism, and make sure that you involve the experts and that they're consulted prior to implementing or proposing any solutions. It's important to have your legal advisors involved. And as you've seen, stratification techniques are generally invaluable, and often the 80-20 rule applies, similar to what we've talked about earlier. And if you really want to impress your customers, stay involved and be a part of the solution. Thank you for taking the time to participate in our on-demand webinar today. I am pleased to inform you that HR and Labor Guru has 3 distinct on-demand webinar series with a total of 7 modules as follows. First, we have the Reduce Your Labor Cost series, and there are 2 modules in this series. Secondly, we have the Bargaining Preparation series, and again, there are 2 modules in this series. And finally, we have the HR Analytics series, and there are 3 modules in this particular series. I would like to take a few minutes to talk to you about the content in the respective series. In a few instances, certain strategic concepts are introduced at a high level in one module, and then for those of you who are interested, presented in a deeper dive format in another module. I will attempt to highlight these situations as I quickly walk you through the module highlights. First, let's talk about the Reduce Your Labor Cost series. These modules will appeal to anyone interested in reducing their labor costs, whether you're an HR or labor professional looking to redesign your compensation and benefit plans, preparing for negotiations with the union, or simply a corporate controller looking for opportunities to reduce labor costs. Part 1 of the Reduce Your Labor Cost series deals with compensation and workforce composition. In this series, you'll develop an in-depth understanding of the numerous financial elements that should be considered when calculating all-in labor costs. Also, you get an understanding of several internal and external factors to take into consideration when contemplating modifications to compensation. Also, compare and contrast employee or union versus company preferences with respect to compensation alternatives, to recognize strategic opportunities to offer lump sums and or variable compensation versus fixed wage increases. And finally, in this module, you'll obtain a clear understanding of how changes to a company's workforce composition can be one of the most union-friendly opportunities to significantly reduce and or mitigate rising all-in labor costs over time. In contrast, Part 2 of the Reduce Your Labor Cost series deals primarily with healthcare, pensions, and other employee benefits. In this module, you'll gain an appreciation for the importance of plan design decisions in driving overall employee healthcare costs. You look at things like employee cost share, delivery models, and clinical programs. Also, you'll look at the identification of the multiple levers, strategies, and tools available to mitigate rising healthcare costs. Also, we'll take a look at a 3-step analytical approach to identify key focus areas in order to facilitate potential cost reduction strategies for healthcare. And also, we'll have a comprehensive strategy to address high-cost healthcare elements using a reduced model. And we'll also take a look at developing win-win healthcare solutions for both employers and employees or their unions. In addition, you'll understand cost mitigation strategies for other employee benefits, including pensions, disability, life insurance, paid time off, and retiree benefits. And finally, we'll learn about proven strategies aimed at reducing other post-employment benefit obligations and costs related to retiree benefits. Secondly, let's talk about the bargaining preparation and strategy formulation series. These modules will appeal to anyone looking for practical guidance relative to preparing for bargaining with the union, whether you're a member of the actual negotiations team or a member of one of the support teams, such as finance or public relations. Most of the content, particularly with respect to strategy formulation, will appeal to all levels of an organization, including directors and vice presidents. Part 1 of this series is called Bargaining Preparation. This module outlines the key negotiations preparation activities that should be performed from 12 to 18 months in advance of bargaining right through to opening day. The key areas of focus for bargainers typically include the following: a bargaining environment assessment, development of a robust internal governance process, development of negotiations costing models, formulation of bargaining strategy, and finally, creation of a comprehensive communication strategy. And all of these elements are dealt with in this module. While negotiations, costing models, and strategy formulation are presented at a high level in Part 1, for those of you interested in more of a deep dive, I would highly recommend looking at Part 2 in this series as well. Part 2 is called Negotiations, Costing Models, and Strategy Formulation. In this module, you'll develop an in-depth understanding of the numerous financial elements that should be considered when calculating all-in labor costs and creating negotiations costing models. You'll also obtain a clear understanding of how to develop a dynamic cost model by utilizing a simple 3-step approach. In addition, you'll learn how to develop practical bargaining tools that can be utilized to improve efficiencies when costing out union demands and management proposals, develop alternative economic offers, and assist in formulating overall bargaining strategy. As well, you'll learn how to develop a simple matrix that will assist the company in identifying potential win-win solutions with the union. And finally, you'll understand the importance of developing a comprehensive economic offer playbook by consolidating input from the various subcommittees. And finally, let's talk about the HR Analytics series. These modules will appeal to a wide variety of professionals, including those in the analytics, finance, HR, and labor relations fields. Part 1 of this series is entitled Building a Value-Added HR Analytics Function. In this module, you'll take a look at the structure, roles, and responsibilities of an effective HR analytics team. We'll also talk about how to address common challenges that companies face in growing their HR analytics function. We'll identify quick wins and value-added projects that will appeal to both HR business partners and HR centers of excellence. And finally, we'll take a look at an introduction to predictive analytics through an illustration of a 6-step process. Part 2 of the HR Analytics series is called Breaking the HR Analytics Paradigm. We're going to be looking at hourly workforce data. First thing we're going to look at is recognizing the low-hanging fruit associated with the examination of hourly workforce data. We're going to focus on operational and cost savings opportunities associated with 3 distinct areas. First, absenteeism, including Family Medical Leave Act in the United States. Secondly, the hourly hiring process. And thirdly, hourly employee payroll data. And the final module in this series is Part 3 that deals with healthcare analytics. We're going to gain an appreciation for the importance of plan design decisions in driving overall employer healthcare costs. Look at things such as employee cost share, delivery models, and clinical programs. In addition, we're going to look at the identification of multiple levers, strategies, and tools available to mitigate rising healthcare costs, and also we'll have to do an in-depth understanding of a 3-step analytical approach to identify key focus areas in order to facilitate potential cost reduction strategies. And we'll also look at a comprehensive strategy to address high-cost elements utilizing the reduce model. And the idea here is to develop win-win solutions for both employers and employees and their unions. Thank you for your time. I hope that these webinars provide you with valuable guidance and practical solutions in addressing the many HR and labor challenges facing your organization.